Captain John Ripley's time at the Marine Corps boot camp had shown him he was meant to be on the front lines. When talking about his training, he'd confess, quote, "The impression of the boot camp is so indelible. It's burned in my memory, that sureness of having achieved something. The effect of that has given me strength over the years. Having one of the drill instructors say, 'Good job, recruit,' meant more to me than any personal decoration." In 1962, he was assigned to serve aboard the carrier USS Independence, putting his degree in electrical engineering to use. It was an important job, but to stay in the relative safety of a ship was not an option for Ripley. His fellow Marines were fighting for their lives across the Asian jungles, and he meant to join in the action. He knew it would be a tough deployment. By then, the enemy was upgrading from guerrillas to disciplined, well-trained conventional soldiers from the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN. Most of them were concentrated in a narrow area known as Leatherneck Square, which was exactly where Ripley had been assigned. The territory was located just south of the Vietnamese demilitarized zone. Here, Marines had to operate under the constant threat of artillery bombardments, ambushes, and infiltration attacks. To counter the threat, Ripley and his teammates decided to launch large-scale search-and-destroy operations, moving straight into enemy-controlled areas, to find and engage rival troops before they could strike first. But the terrain was not on America's side. Even if Ripley could reach the PAVN's doorstep, the enemy often knew how to exploit the rugged, treacherous land. They were able to remain hidden for hours, waiting for just the right moment to launch a surprise attack. Ripley and his team were suddenly being pinned down by large North Vietnamese forces closing in from every angle. Captain John Ripley didn't have a large group to cover him. Still, he didn't mind braving fire to reach his fellow troops. During a particularly dangerous rescue, enemy fire reached Ripley before he could break up and attack. Still, he didn't peel away from the fight. As soon as the bleeding was under control, the captain picked up his rifle and charged toward the North Vietnamese once more. Most men who were injured in battle would have pulled back from the fight, maybe even tried to get sent back home. But Ripley was a Marine, and he meant to put himself at the front lines time and again if that's what it took to save his teammates. So by the time he was finally able to return to base, he didn't care how long it would take for him to heal, but rather when he would get another chance at coming face to face with the enemy. The mission Ripley had been waiting for came on August 21st. An American convoy had been surrounded by a wall of PAVN fighters who were now rapidly closing in on them. It was up to Ripley to relieve the formation before it was too late. Captain Rip didn't have much to work with. He was leading a single rifle platoon, a small command group, and 2 M42 Duster anti-aircraft vehicles. To put this in context, a force like this would typically consist of only a few dozen men, meaning Ripley was trying to rescue an entire trapped convoy with little more than a reinforced classroom's worth of Marines. The only way to gain the upper hand in the battle was for Ripley to spot the enemy before they could make the first move. However, no matter how attentively the captain inspected the thick bushes and dense canopy surrounding his formation, there was no telltale sign of the PAVN's presence. A less experienced captain might have believed the North Vietnamese attackers had already broken off their assault, but Ripley knew his rivals were still out there. They were observing every one of his moves from concealed positions, awaiting the moment the Marines let down their guard. Suddenly, a twig snapped. For a moment, no one in Ripley's formation dared breathe. Rifles were pointed in every direction as men assumed battle positions, but before the Americans could fire a single round, a bullet flew from the jungle toward them. Troops barely had time to react before a barrage of recoilless rifle fire erupted. The shells came in so fast that Ripley couldn't even tell where they were coming from. The chances of rescuing the convoy ahead were not looking good. But Ripley still had a chance of saving himself if he called for retreat. But that wasn't the mission the captain had been sent for. Rather than seek cover, Rip jumped into one of the vehicles riding alongside his formation. This put him right in the line of fire, but if he moved quickly, he could identify the exact location of the concealed North Vietnamese troops from this elevated vantage point. Weaving through enemy fire, the captain traced the trajectories of incoming rounds to the enemy position and opened fire. Ripley understood that his men were trapped, but he had bought them just enough time to dismount and organize into a defensive perimeter so they wouldn't be caught in the open. Still, the North Vietnamese were relentless, and even after the Americans managed to regroup, they kept creeping closer and closer. It's been reported that at one point, the enemy was about 55 yards from Ripley. That was too close to order an airstrike, yet that's exactly what the captain did. For roughly 3 hours, the captain kept directing artillery, coordinating airstrikes, and controlling his Marines, until the North Vietnamese troops finally retreated. This wouldn't be the only time the captain would expose himself to extreme danger to solve a tactical problem. Later in the year, Ripley's combat tour ended. But as soon as his aircraft took off from Vietnam, and the captain looked down on the still enemy-infested jungle below, he knew his job was far from over. He was leaving only because he needed to become an even better Marine before his next face-off with the PAVN. It wasn't that his commanders thought John Ripley wasn't good enough. In fact, his service during his first tour was so impressive that the company, led by the captain, came to be known as Ripley's Raiders for its outstanding counterstrikes against the PAVN. However, no soldier could ever stop perfecting their craft, and officials knew that with just a little more training, this Marine had enough potential to become one of the most lethal assets in America's ranks. During his first deployment to Vietnam, Ripley had served primarily as a combat leader. Next time, he would have to become a commander capable of coordinating entire battlefield systems at once. To achieve this, Ripley was first to attend the Amphibious Warfare School. Here, the captain was to learn how to plan assaults from ship to shore, coordinating naval infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft, so that regardless of the position he found himself in, he had the necessary skills to stage an effective strike. After completing his amphibious assault training, Ripley was sent to England to sharpen his intelligence skills. For the next couple of years, he served alongside the United Kingdom Special Boat Service, one of the most highly secretive branches of the Royal Navy. Its mission demanded expertise in surveillance, reconnaissance, and covert target acquisition. While in the UK, Ripley also served with the British Royal Marines, where he learned yet another valuable skill in team solidarity. Unlike the American Marines, the Royal Branch was known for keeping troops in the same unit for much longer periods. The same men often trained, deployed, and fought together. To some, it may not have seemed like a drastic change, but for a man like Ripley, who believed deeply in loyalty, leadership, and small unit cohesion, this would become the guiding principle for keeping his men fighting in unison when he was sent back to the battlefield. That day came in 1971. Ripley was deployed to the same area where he had first served. By then, hundreds of thousands of troops had already been pulled back after years of large-scale enemy attacks had claimed the lives of thousands and shattered the hopes for an American victory. It was not the sort of battlefield any soldier wants to find himself in, but as Ripley would later put it, quote, "When I got to Vietnam the second time, I'd had the best training possible. And now, it was time for the captain to put it to the test, before the PAVN could deliver the finishing blow." Ripley had been away from the Vietnamese front lines for so long that he'd forgotten that it was when the land was at its quietest that the enemy was preparing to launch its biggest strikes. And by spring of 1972, the battlefield was worryingly calm. The first signs that something was wrong came when Ripley and his men received reports of a North Vietnamese probe lurking near several American bases across the area. It wasn't uncommon for the enemy to target these outposts, so the Marines weren't too worried at first. Even if a group of North Vietnamese Army or NVA fighters was preparing to launch a strike, local defenders would likely be able to push them back before the situation escalated. But then, the artillery fire started. The Marines had not received any warning that a heavily armed enemy formation was moving toward their position. Worse still, even after South Vietnamese troops were sent to hold off the attackers, the NVA formation refused to back away. the situation wasn't looking good. If the enemy kept marching south unchallenged, the whole area could soon be overrun. Ripley once noted, quote, "We were considered the division reserve, the unit least likely to get involved. But at this point, every man was needed on the front lines, and Captain Rip wouldn't think twice before heading out to battle." During his first tour, Ripley had already witnessed firsthand just how brutal the NVA could be. However, as the captain made his way toward the city of Dong Ha, near the border with North Vietnam, he realized this might be the toughest enemy formation he'd ever encountered. Even when night arrived, and the darkness made it nearly impossible to see a thing across the battlefield, the North Vietnamese kept blindly firing their shells across the field. Ripley knew that his men would have no chance to fight back until the barrage eased, but luckily for him, he was familiar enough with the terrain to know the buildings around the area that he and his men could go to for cover. It wasn't only that the enemy was much stronger than Ripley and his fellow Marines had anticipated, but also that the captain couldn't stand the thought of his teammates succumbing to the North Vietnamese fire. He'd already been in this position at Dong Ha. He once revealed, quote, "That night was a poignant reminder of the past, as I spent the night in the old 3rd Marine Division morgue. It was the same place where I'd identified the remains of my Marines 5 years earlier. The memories were too much to bear." As soon as the sun rose on the horizon, the North Vietnamese fire gave the Americans a momentary break. Ripley jumped out of his hideout and rushed toward the craters left behind by the enemy fire. By simply looking at their shape and size, he could get an idea of where the shells had come from. If the Americans were going to beat the incoming attackers, it would come down to Captain Rip alone to devise a defensive strategy. But he was working with impossible numbers. The city was protected by about 700 troops, while across the DMZ, more than 30,000 North Vietnamese troops marched toward Ripley's position, supported by heavy artillery. According to initial reports, the North Vietnamese had around 20 tanks in their formation, but when aerial patrols took off to confirm the size of the strike group, the Americans realized how wrong they were. Pilots reported back to Ripley, quote, "We got bumper-to-bumper tanks from the Ben Hai River all the way to Dong Ha. They can't even turn around, they've got so many of them." This formed an armored column spanning about 17 miles, believed to contain about 200 tanks, ready to shatter the Marine positions ahead. Captain Rip put it simply, quote, "We didn't have the wherewithal to stop that many tanks. We had little handheld weapons, and we certainly didn't have anything on the scale that was needed to deal with the threat." Ripley knew he had only one option left. Separating the two armies was the Qua Viet River. For the North Vietnamese tanks to reach Dong Ha, they had to first squeeze through a single bridge, the only crossing capable of supporting an armored assault. If the defenders managed to stop the armored vehicles from reaching the other side, the city of Dong Ha and the Marines fighting for it could still have a chance to survive. A unit of fighters was deployed to cover the bridge, but the moment the North Vietnamese flag appeared on the other side of the river, the artillery bombardment became so intense that headquarters determined that if the battalion stayed where it was, it would soon be wiped out. The only sound response now was to withdraw while there was still a chance to escape the massacre. But just as the Marines began pulling back, Captain Rip realized the 20th South Vietnamese Tank Battalion was arriving at the scene. It was a risk to keep the counter-strike going, but if Ripley didn't at least try, then he'd risk having his fellow Marines caught by the enemy. The way the captain saw it, he had no real option. An Allied tank battalion was positioned not too far from the bridge. If the captain managed to make his way to it and convince the South Vietnamese to let him borrow a tank, perhaps he could still find a way to stop the invasion before it was too late. But by now, making his way across the field was nearly impossible. The North Vietnamese had secured a solid footing on the other side of the bridge, from which they were unleashing a storm of fire unlike anything Ripley had ever seen. There was no way to make it across the city in one piece, but luckily for the Marines in the area, the enemy was not the only one who knew how to exploit the terrain. After his first deployment, Ripley had become somewhat of an expert in the area, and he knew that just around an old Marine combat base lay a route that even the Vietnamese were unfamiliar with. Cutting through there, the captain could approach the South Vietnamese tanks without being seen. But reaching the armored vehicles was only the first part of the mission. Ripley knew he'd never be able to defeat 30,000 soldiers and 200 tanks on his own. Still, he was confident he could blow up a bridge, and that was all he needed to stop the PAVN invasion. The South Vietnamese had been preparing to blow up the bridge for several days now. The explosives were not set in the right place yet, but he was willing to get them ready with his own hands, even if he had to do it as a legion of North Vietnamese fighters stared at him with rifles in hand from the other side of the river. First, Ripley had to reach a bunker beneath the bridge, which would serve as a base. From there, alongside 20th Tank Battalion Advisor Army Major Jim Smock, Rip would prepare to position 500 pounds of TNT across the structure. If each charge was set at just the right place, then the American captain could deliver enough damage to slash any chance of North Vietnamese troops crossing to the other side. However, the road ahead wasn't easy. The PAVN had likely realized what Ripley was up to. A few enemy soldiers were already going across the river, seeking to seize the bridge before Ripley could destroy it. From within his borrowed South Vietnamese tank, Ripley could withstand the incoming shells from the smaller artillery, but as he drew closer to his target, the enemy tanks preparing to cross began turning their cannons toward his position and opening fire. The captain could barely make it to the bridge, and even upon arriving, he knew he had only so much time before the enemy strikes got close enough to claim him. The strategy was relatively simple. Smock was to push the boxes of TNT to Ripley, who, hanging beneath the bridge with his bare hands and secured only by the strength of his arms, would get them into place whichever way he could. His technique, as described by Ripley, was to, quote, hand walk out and swing up to get his heels into the I-beam. Then he'd swing down on one T-beam and then leap over and grab another T-beam. Because he lacked the proper tools, Ripley had to crimp the blasting caps onto the detonating cord with his teeth. He then connected every box of explosives with a primer cord, creating a single ignition line that would detonate all 500 pounds at once. Some sources state it took Ripley around 2 hours to place the explosives across the underside of the bridge, while others state it was 5 hours of hard work before the TNT was ready to go off. Whenever he felt the strength leaving his body, he'd just repeat the same chant over and over again, quote, Jesus, Mary, get me there. Ripley said that he remembered seeing the North Vietnamese looking at him from the other side of the bridge. He couldn't understand why they weren't shooting at him or trying to cross the bridge. At one point, he even considered that perhaps they felt sorry for him, seeing him as a desperate Marine fighting an impossible mission. It's also possible that given the awkward position Ripley was in just beneath the bridge, it was difficult for the enemy to land a close hit, which is why, from the captain's point of view, the enemy wasn't even trying to neutralize him. Some other reports suggest that while the enemy did attempt to shoot down the captain, throughout the process of preparing the explosives, Allied tanks and fellow Marines provided covering fire, which kept their captain safe. As for the enemy refusing to cross the bridge, it's likely that the commanders refused to risk their armored vehicles, as there was no way of knowing exactly when the bridge would come down. Whatever the case, Ripley was able to finish his job before a bullet got to him or the enemy made its way to the other side of the river. Now, it was time for the bridge to come down. Ripley needed to get away fast. The fuses were already burning, and because the captain didn't have any tools by his side, he only had an approximate idea of when the explosives would go off. However, just before he could get away, the captain realized he needed to go back beneath the bridge. Ripley had come across a set of electric blasting caps left behind by South Vietnamese troops. Going back and setting them up was the only way to ensure the bridge would still go off if the time fuses failed. He knew it was a dangerous gamble. If he had miscalculated the timing of the explosion and the fuses went off, then he would be wiped out alongside the bridge. But if he fled the scene and the explosion failed to happen, there was no way he'd be able to brave the enemy fire to get back there again. And so, the captain climbed beneath the bridge once more, moving as fast as he could to rewire the explosives with the electrical backup, while the time fuses kept burning. Either through Ripley's talent or just pure luck, the captain managed to get the explosives ready. And while enemy fire continued to crash around him, his only injuries came from the barbed wire stretched beneath the bridge. With the TNT set, Ripley sprinted back to the South Vietnamese lines and took cover. It's said that the explosion was so devastating that the bridge, which was partly made of timber, burned for 5 whole days. The North Vietnamese toward Dong Ha had been effectively stopped, and while numerous Marines still lost their lives during the defense of the city, Ripley's actions had bought troops all across the region another day of fighting and another chance to go back home. And that was what had always mattered most to John Ripley. On June 18, 2026, when he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his service in Vietnam, his son declared before President Trump, quote, "Our father loved the Marine Corps and viewed his actions at Dong Ha Bridge not as heroism, but as simply doing his duty. He was a Marine, doing what he was trained to do."